These are the actual images captured during the Stanford Prison Experiment. After 5 days, the prisoners were in pieces, constantly mistreated and humiliated by the guards, and the lawyers were planning a way to get them out as soon as possible. Welcome to a new episode of Absurd But True, account of one of the most discussed experiments in the world of psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment. To tell you this story, I decided to personally contact the staff of the psychologist who created the experiment, asking for permission to use the official images collected by security cameras. So what you will see are the original videos shot in 1971. But let's go in order. The idea behind this experiment was as simple as it was controversial. Imagine taking 24 students and half of them playing guards in a fake prison, while the other half playing fake prisoners. The goal was to understand whether a hostile environment like a prison could take an ordinary person and make them capable. This effect, known as the Lucifer effect, was theorized by psychologist Philip Zimbardo from Stanford University between the 1960s and 1970s. However, he was not the only one interested in this experiment. In fact, the entire study was funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research, which was interested in studying how prison riots originate. This was the plan for the experiment. First, it was necessary to create a fake prison, and as a location, they considered using the basement of Stanford's psychology department. There, in fact, was a corridor with 3 rooms facing it, each measuring 2.7 by 2.8 meters, which could serve as prison cells, along with a smaller room, measuring 60 by 60 centimeters, that could be used as an isolation cell. In another wing of the floor, a section dedicated to the guards was planned, including a sleeping area, a bathroom, and a recreational space. The interesting thing is that there were no clocks or windows planned. Pay attention, this was not a random choice. Why? They thought. Once the inmates entered, it would be much more difficult for them to determine the passage of time this way, and as a result, they would become disoriented much more quickly. To find volunteers, an ad was published. Those who participated in the experiment would earn $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks, which in today's value amounts to approximately $1,400. A total of 70 people responded, but only 24 were selected. All of them were men from the middle class, with a medium to high level of education, and without any kind of criminal record. No history of heavy drug abuse or aggressive behavior. So, a very carefully selected group. And keep this information in mind because we'll come back to it later at the end of the video. Completely at random, Dr. Zimbardo and his team would decide who would be the 12 guards and the 12 prisoners. Out of these, 9 and 9 would actually participate in the experiment, while the others would be kept in reserve in case they were needed. So, in 1971, the decision was made to start the experiment. On August 15th, the 9 volunteers chosen as prisoners were arrested without warning by real police officers and taken to the mock prison at Stanford. Once there, they were made to undress, sprayed with a disinfectant, and given a smock with a serial number, which from that moment on would be their new name. Each prisoner also had a heavy metal chain on their right ankle that could never be removed, constantly reminding them that they were in prison. Let's clarify something. This was actually a harsher treatment than what was typically received in a real prison. However, Dr. Zimbardo, as we mentioned, needed to quickly depersonalize the prisoners, and he couldn't afford to wait for months. So now, let's get back to the story. We've looked at the prisoners, but now let's take a moment to examine the guards. They all wore khaki uniforms, carried batons, and had mirrored sunglasses. This was meant to enhance their sense of authority over the prisoners. They worked in 3 shifts of 8 hours each, meaning they could actually go home between shifts. And no one taught them how to be guards. They were simply told to maintain order and ensure that the prison operated smoothly, regardless of the method. Or at least, that's what has been told for decades. In 2024, A study was published that not only confirmed that Zimbardo had instructed the guards, but also that he and the staff had encouraged them from the very beginning to be violent and cruel toward the prisoners. But we'll get to that in a bit. During the first day, the guards, in addition to establishing a set of rules, introduced the concept of prisoner roll calls and then sent everyone to bed. And just think, this was only the first day and the prisoners had no idea that this was nothing compared to what was coming next. During the first night, at 2:30 a.m., the guards woke the prisoners with their whistles for the first of many roll calls, but the prisoners still did not respect the guards' authority. So, to assert their authority, the guards started making them do push-ups. At first, only for a few minutes, but as we will see, as the days went by, these sessions would stretch to entire hours. The following morning, something happened that no one would have expected. The first major problem. The prisoners revolted against the guards, barricaded themselves in their cells, tore off their identification numbers, and threw their beds against the bars. The guards, in order to quell the riot, sprayed the fire extinguishers at the prisoners, took away all their beds and clothes, revoked their permission to use the bathroom, and placed the leaders of the revolt in isolation. The situation was brought back under control, but the tension skyrocketed. The guards then decided to be cunning. They placed the new prisoners in only 2 cells without beds and kept the 3rd cell as a luxury cell, a sort of privilege to try to break the solidarity among the prisoners. However, less than 36 hours after the experiment began, another problem arose. Prisoner 8612 began to break down both physically and psychologically, to the point that Dr. Zimbardo, who had meanwhile taken on the role of prison superintendent, decided to let him go. What Zimbardo did not yet suspect, however, was that the prisoners were planning an escape. On the 3rd day, friends and family came to visit the prisoners. So the cells were cleaned, the prisoners were tidied up, and to ensure that nothing leaked out, the conversations were constantly monitored by the guards. As a result, no prisoner said anything. At the end of the day, however, a guard overheard the prisoners mumbling and discovered something completely unexpected. The prisoners were planning an escape. More specifically, their plan was to escape with the help of prisoner 8612, the one who had just been released. He would return with some friends and help his fellow prisoners escape. As a result, Dr. Zimbardo was informed, and he decided to take the prisoners, put hoods over their heads, and move them to the 5th floor of the building. According to the doctor's plan, when prisoner 8612 arrived with reinforcements, he would not find his fellow inmates in their cells. But the doctor, sitting on a chair in the middle of the prison, would tell him, "The experiment is over, there's no one left to free, they've all been sent home." So the doctor had the prisoners moved, sat down, and waited. And he waited. And he waited some more. There was no escape attempt underway. It was fake news. So the guards brought the prisoners back to their cells, but feeling mocked, they continued to harass them even more than before. The guards' violence worsened. The prisoners lived in miserable conditions, ate poorly, and were victims of the guards' violence. The push-ups, as I was saying, are now being done for entire hours, and during these days, some prisoners actually had the opportunity to speak with a real priest who had come to visit them. They introduced themselves not with their baptismal name, but with their serial number. Interestingly, it was the priest himself who advised them to contact lawyers to get out of there. He personally took it upon himself to deliver this message to the prisoners' relatives, who then took action through legal channels. The situation quickly spiraled out of control in just a few days, and prisoner 819 started feeling so unwell that he, too, was removed from the experiment. In his place, prisoner 416 was introduced, and we will talk about him shortly. On the 5th day, the prisoners were given the opportunity to negotiate for parole. The remarkable thing is that all of them were willing to give up everything they had earned up to that point just to obtain it. This, once again, demonstrated how deeply they had internalized the prison mentality. By the way, do you remember prisoner 416, the last one who had just arrived? Well, he immediately found himself in an atmosphere of violence, and so he started a hunger strike to protest against the treatment he was subjected to. However, instead of receiving support from the other prisoners, they were so exhausted that they turned against him, considering him a troublemaker. Because of him, In fact, that day's visits were suspended, and as punishment, for 16 was left in the isolation cell for 3 hours, even though the maximum time allowed by the regulations was only 60 minutes. We are on the 6th day. The guards were becoming increasingly sadistic, especially their leader, nicknamed John Wayne, and the prisoners were suffering more and more. It is at this point in the story that Dr. Christina Maslach, a colleague of Zimbardo, enters the scene. She unexpectedly happens to discover the conditions the prisoners are in, sees the surveillance footage, is astonished, and discusses with the doctor the fact that the experiment is completely immoral. As if that weren't enough, Dr. Zimbardo himself was also contacted by the prisoners' lawyers, who were already taking steps to stop the experiment. So, the combination of all these factors, the violence inside the prison, his assistant's comment, and the fact that the lawyers were already taking action, pushed Dr. Zimbardo, albeit reluctantly, to halt the experiment on August 20th, 1971, a full 8 days earlier than originally planned. Well, that was the Stanford experiment, but since lawyers were brought into the discussion, one might wonder whether conducting such an experiment was actually legal. In reality, yes, it was legal to do so, both because at the beginning of the experiment, all participants were required to sign a liability waiver, and because the experiment was approved not only by the government but also by several authoritative organizations, such as the Human Subject Research Review Committee, the American Psychological Association, and of course, the university itself. Nevertheless, over the years many have criticized this study, both from an ethical and a scientific standpoint. In fact, to summarize, this is an experiment that cannot be replicated. The sample of volunteers was not randomly selected from the population, as we mentioned at the beginning. And in reality, when the BBC attempted to recreate the same experiment in 2002 for a TV series, things did not go nearly as badly. At the same time, however, it is worth noting that this experiment also had some positive outcomes, if we can put it that way. For example, it led to the introduction of federal laws to protect young people in prisons and raised awareness among the military to warn against the abuse of power, as unfortunately happened in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in 2003. A little final tidbit before we wrap up, because when I found this out, I just had to share it with you. Do you remember Dr. Maslach, the one who put a stop to the experiment? Well, she eventually became Dr. Zimbardo's wife and is now an expert on workplace burnout. Alright guys, thanks for sticking with me until the end. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did, because this is one of the stories that has fascinated me the most since I've been here at Geopop. And actually, while I was researching, I realized that there are so many experiments like this, some of which even ended badly at times. So, if you're interested in this kind of topic, you can first of all drop some suggestions in the comments, if you already have any, but most importantly, if you want more videos like this Riot experiment, so I know you're interested and I can bring you more in the meantime, I'll see you in the next video right here on Geopop Everyday Science.